is that we've had a number of things in the external environment which are much more favorable to rapid agricultural growth before. Now, I'm going to wind up shortly, and I want to talk about what has to be done if we want to get back to getting rapid decline in poverty in the world and improvement in food security. And remember that there was a time when poverty was declining very rapidly in the world. Most of that has slowed down. Certainly in India, it has slowed down sharply. It's certainly slowed down very sharply in Indonesia. In other words, in the middle-income countries, which had the really big declines in poverty, it slowed down in most cases, not in all cases. And in most cases, you'll find that the agricultural growth rate has slowed down also, and there's a reason for that. Again, I'm not talking generally about the middle-income countries because they're going to continue to grow rapidly. They're probably going to continue to neglect agriculture. It means their poverty rates won't decline very rapidly, but they'll get pretty rapid growth in GDP, and everybody that counts, which is at least 20% of the population, will live happily ever after under those circumstances. Now, what do you have to do in the low-income countries in foreign aid in order to get rapid reduction in poverty, which is clearly possible? We've seen it demonstrated in place after place. The number one thing you have to do is to get back to agriculture. And, IFPRI emphasizes this over and over again. I'm going to put it much more tersely than IFPRI does. Yes, the World Development Report is a help, although it's a little hard when you read that to pull out the 12 things you're supposed to actually do to get it moving. We need to get U.S. aid back into agriculture in a big way. We used to lead the world. We're highly respected for what we know about agriculture and what we've achieved in, so we would build on strength and respect and build that strength and respect. What does that mean in budget terms? A minimum of 25% of the aid budget should be going to agricultural growth. That means a 12-fold increase in how much goes to agriculture from where it is now, 12 times. Now, I think it's highly unlikely we're going to see much increase in the foreign assistance budget in this country in the next few years. I think Mr. Obama talked about a doubling of foreign aid. I noticed that both in the debates when both he and Mr. Biden were pressed where they could make some cuts, the only thing they could think of was cutting foreign aid. That was the only thing that got mentioned specifically for reduction. So we're not going to see much increase for a while. So it means there has to be a massive reallocation. Health gets 20 times as much support as agriculture does. That has to be where a big hunk of the reallocation comes from. And what do you do when you have the guy that helped destroy Russia, an eminent economist, saying that we need to put more emphasis on health, Jeffrey Sachs? It was probably, some people probably think it was a good thing that he helped destroy Russia. Not many Russians think that. But what's he talk about now? He talks mostly about health and money on health. Do we really have the right proportions between health and agriculture and poverty reduction and nutrition improvement? Do we have the right proportions on those? Granted, they're complementary, that when you get employment growing rapidly, you want more young people to be healthy and educated. And by the way, the elasticity of the demand for educated people in rural areas, it tends to be in primary and secondary, but the demand for educated people in rural areas is elastic with respect to the growth rate of employment in rural areas. So when you get that whole employment thing going, the demand for education goes up, and of course being healthy is pretty helpful in that context. So we're talking about, we're recognizing the complementarity, we're talking about the balance. And there has to be something very major done. Well, you can see why I said the answer to my question at the beginning was no. Is that going to happen? I mean, it doesn't seem very likely. So the first thing we have to do is return to agriculture. And we have to do that with a massive reallocation of resources within the aid budget. Good luck. The second thing we have to do is to focus on national aggregates. We have to get away from a little project in this part of Kenya that's concerned with helping the private sector provide some few services to the farmers and what have you in that little area. We've got to get back to saying we're going to accelerate the aggregate growth rate in agriculture from 3% to 5%. We're going to add 2 percentage points to it. And here's how we're going to go about doing that. Now, as soon as you set the aggregate target so that you're saying we're going to add 2 percentage points to the agricultural growth rate, then most of the stuff which you're doing now, even in agriculture, goes out the window because it's not going to have any measurable effect on getting that extra 2 percentage points to the growth rate. So as soon as you decide that you're going to focus on national aggregates, the whole approach to your aid program changes radically. And incidentally, the measures of success change radically. And they become much messier, by the way, when they change. The measures of success of an aid project now are pretty straightforward. They become very messy when you do this. The third thing, so the first was return to agriculture, and I'm not saying you do only agriculture, you just want the balance somewhere near right. Second is national aggregates. The third, you've got to focus on building institutions, and this means mostly public institutions. It's always a little bit amusing to me that all this talk about the private sector, and yet you have all these government bureaucrats running out trying to tell private businessmen how they can run their business better. And we're trying to do this at the very macro level now, so big business even we're trying to do that with. But I'm not very optimistic about low-level aid bureaucrats going out and telling private traders how to do a better job of trading. Now, there are some supports the private sector that can be very useful. Trade associations, I think, do make a lot of sense. They can be used to lobby. They can be used to get some scale economies for small firms and so forth and so on. So there are obviously things you can do to strengthen the private sector. But there has to be a huge effort on building the public sector institutions. The first rule I would have as a change here absolutely appalls all my friends in the NGOs. We're going to be stuck with having to have a lot of what used to be done directly by aid done through contractors because of this huge collapse in capability in aid. I'll come back to that for just a moment. But I worked with Rockefeller Foundation in India back in '63, '64. They had a super program there. Their intent was to get first-rate applied research done. And they brought out mostly youngish people with a couple of older people and more senior people involved. And those people went out and did research. The Rockefeller Foundation never, we're talking about India in this case, they never hired an Indian scientist on their staff. That was absolutely verboten. They did hire some Indian administrators, okay? Now you say, goodness gracious, but weren't they supposed to be building up capacity? Well, every one of those young scientists worked with roughly a dozen Indian scientists, but they were all in the national system, and they had to work with people in the national system. So when Rockefeller left, there was this huge number of Indians who had hands-on training. None of the Rockefeller people were called consultants. They were out there to do a job. They were out there to breed better maize varieties and to breed better sorghum varieties and so on. But they were to do it working with nationals in the national system. And the nationals got a lot of the credit for it, as they should have. There were a lot of goodies. How do when NGOs say, no, we couldn't do that, there aren't competent people in the government. Well, one reason there are no competent people in the government, you just hired them all away. Again, I'm using Afghanistan as a case. The moment a competent person shows up in the Ministry of Agriculture, they're gone in a month or so at a tripled salary. And raising the national salaries isn't any good in dealing with that. It's a good thing in its own right, but it doesn't deal with that because the NGOs and the private contractors have to have those people, and they'll pay whatever it takes to get them. So no matter how much you push the national levels up, the contractors will go higher. They just have to be told they can't hire them. Now, there may have to be a little transition on this and so on. How are you going to get good people in the government? Well, the people who work with Rockefeller, they got a lot out of that. They had at least a 50% chance that they would get a fellowship to the U.S. that would get them a PhD degree. That was a tremendous incentive. When they traveled, they got a very healthy per diem. There are a lot of other little goodies that came along. There was no topping up of salaries, and USAID, probably for good reason, doesn't like to do that. But the bottom line on this is you've got to work with people in the government. You can't do that if you're hiring them away from the government. And of course, you're destroying the government's reputation by this. I remember sitting, I'm sorry I'm using so many Afghanistan examples, but I just happened to have spent a lot of time in the field there over the last several years, partly for family reasons. Sitting down with a group of elders in an evening and asked them, what do you think of the government? And the government is personalized, it's Karzai, and terrible. All they do is taxes. They don't do anything for us. But what about all these rural development projects? Oh, that's the NGOs. They don't know what NGO stands for, but they've got that acronym in their mind. And the NGOs are, in general, the Aga Khan's an exception to that, Aga Khan Foundation, but in general, they're going around saying to the village people, we're all that stands between you and your incompetent, corrupt government. So if we move to institution building, there's a lot that has to be done, and it's not very easy. And by the way, I learned this from Ray Love, but you're going to do a lot of contracting with the government, and that means that you're going to have to go back with control systems that we used to have. That result in you release the funds only when things get done, and you play a major role in seeing to it that corruption is reduced in that. So there are indicated three things that have to change: return to agriculture, national aggregates, institution building. The fourth I've mentioned earlier, massive training of nationals. And again, I keep using the Afghanistan example, but it's just absolutely criminal that we've done so little in training Afghans to take over in these positions. And I want to emphasize that we talk a lot about governance. What does governance mean? If you're trying to develop democratic government, and it's moving not so well here and there, but if you're trying to develop democratic government in a low-income country, it means rural. Who are the important people in rural areas? It's not the poorest of the poor. It's the people who've got enough land to be prosperous by the standards of their community, not by my standards, but by the standards of their community. And governance to them is a question of what kinds of things are being done so that they can become more prosperous. It means increase their agricultural production, so that we should be spending a lot less money with this airy-fairy stuff that we do on governance, and a lot more helping to build national institutions that are delivering economic services to rural people that help them increase their incomes and give us all of that multipliers. And the sixth thing that I want to mention is there has to be, of course, a complete restaffing of USAID. You've got to get back to having technical people in USAID. It's a disaster now. There are very, very few technically competent people in any field in the agency, and you can't do the things that I'm talking about here without that. Keep in mind that when you restaff with technically competent people, you immediately lose flexibility to shift around amongst programs. And of course, that's exactly why you got rid of the technical people, because the fads were changing every year from Congress. The earmarkings were this, you wanted to do women this year, and you wanted to do integrated farm management, integrated something or other on farms. That was a big fashion for a while, so I've even forgotten what it was called, as so long ago now. And you do microcredit another year and so on. And technical people they have an allegiance not just to their boss, but they have an allegiance to a profession. And they may downgrade that a bit off and on to get promoted, but it's always there. So when you start moving towards much higher proportion of technical people, you can't suddenly shift around with all of these fads, which of course is a good thing in itself, but that's a problem. Now, let me just summarize that if we really wanted to do something about poverty reduction in low-income countries, the first thing we have to do is to admit that there was a time when poverty was coming down fairly rapidly, even in some low-income countries that are now middle income, but were low income then, and that we've been a failure over the last 20 or 30 years. If you don't admit that, then you go on the way you are. Secondly, we have to recapture a lot of the elements of the early successes. We know a lot about what the relationships are and so on. Third, we have to recognize that poverty in low-income countries, I'm not talking about middle-income countries, poverty in low-income countries is mostly a rural problem. Even the urban is a rural problem. Cities in Africa, in poor African countries, grow faster than cities in Asian countries that are prospering. Why is that? Because in Africa, the cities are growing rapidly because people are being driven out of the rural areas because they're such sad places. There's no infrastructure, and there's no growth, and there's no income, and there's no employment, and so forth and so on. So that even the urban problem in low-income countries is derived from the rural problem. It's a function of the rural-urban income disparities. As soon as you recognize that the problem is rural, you then have to see that agriculture is the driving engine. And I remember that Bruce Johnson, I'm almost through here, Bruce Johnson and I published an article in the American Economic Review a very long time ago that was quoted a lot. And people now think it was an article that told you why agriculture was important. Well, that's not what the article was about at all. It was entitled The Role of Agriculture in Economic Development. But everybody in those days, including the macroeconomists, assumed that agriculture was important. The purpose of our article was to show how it was important and what that implied about how you went about developing it. So we spent all our time in those days basically talking about how you developed agriculture. Now you spend half your time trying to say it's important. We have to get out of that and get back with 25% of the aid budget going to agriculture, and then get at the question of how's it going to be spent effectively in that context. And the fourth concluding point is we've got to start looking at the various components of human welfare as complements: the health, the education, the rising income, the employment, the nutritional status. These are all complementary, and we have to talk about what the right balance is of those things. And the final comment I want to make, these are very radical changes I'm talking about. They may sound innocuous the way I've put them here. They're very radical changes. You're not going to get these kind of changes in foreign aid without the very top accepting them, recognizing them, and acting on them. I think we got a little bit of that when Andrew Natsios came in. I think he saw some of these things and I think was effective for a year or so in getting shifts in the right direction. And then he became sort of the desk officer for Iraq and southern Sudan and so on. And that was the end of that kind of reform in aid. I think Peter McPherson grasped these points and moved them along quite a lot, but then he left and we got somebody else in and so on. So you have to have top management on board. Why would I be depressed after listening to all of this? The most depressing thing is to say that top management has to be on board. How do you get top management on board nowadays in saying that agriculture should take 25% of the aid budget? And that's a minimum. I just would look nutty if I said 40%, so I say 25%. But if you're serious about poverty, why only 25% on it? Well, I think you have to be depressed about the top of aid. Carol Lancaster gave a talk the other day in which she said, you remember she was the deputy director of aid for a while in the Clinton period, and she said, we're very good at health. Maybe we should do only health in the foreign aid program. Well, to talk about getting that may have been a ploy to sort of knock down the health people competing to be the administrator of aid, but so I may be misreading that entirely. But it's going to be very hard to even think about top management grasping these points.